Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 12th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 11th, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited based off of the conversation we had last week, the conversation we'll have this week. This is such an amazing growing season. As I've stated so many times before, the season after Pentecost is such an undervalued season, and I know partially why. Here in the United States, this is a vacation time of year. It's a typical time of year where people will miss more Sundays, and it's unfortunate because there is so much depth that is within these texts. There is so much we can learn and grow from, and I think there is some really good, hard-hitting topics. And it's just a time of the year that being in the Northern Hemisphere that we have better weather and a lot of people aren't there for it. And if you're tuning into this, you're there for it. You are ready for this. And I think it's extremely important. This is the type of stuff where we really get to understand the meaning of what it means to have Jesus come to earth, be in and amongst our lives. And that's so important and so valuable that we don't really get into it deep enough, and how often our understanding of what our faith is so shallow because we don't get to these moments, because we don't give ourselves the time to get into these types of texts like we have this week. And there is some hard-hitting texts. But before we get into this week, we need to look at last week's question, which was, when did you have to make a difficult decision to wait on something that you easily could have done right now for the betterment of something or something else? And I had a really good example come in this week, and it's with parenting. How easy it is, and now granted I have not parented, how easy it is though when you are in a position of leadership or you are in an argument with a sibling, with a spouse, and to take that out immediately on them. And where at times to really be able to do and live out what God has called us to do, we sometimes need to take a breath. We sometimes need to be able to reflect and take time and work through things. And that's not easy. That's not easy work. That's hard work. It takes a lot of time and a lot of deciphering and being able to get out of your own head. I know for myself personally, and I don't think I've stated it here, I had worked in youth ministry for 5.5 years, and at the end of May, I decided to step away from the church that I was working at. And there was various different reasons for that. But in myself, there has been a lot of working through it mentally and emotionally and spiritually on how do I work through these different things that I had started to see and different issues that I had, and what is the heart of a lot of these different issues. And one of the things that I am slowly realizing, it's the frustration on how overall in the church, there's times where we get stubborn. And it can be as an individual, which I definitely have my own fair streak of that, but I think also as a church body, whether we realize it or not, against other groups of people, can be other church denominations or just how different people are viewing things. And it's frustrating because it divides the body of Christ instead of actually looking at where are the things that we can come together. And how many times I've stated that type of thing on the podcast before. And so I think it's something, as I continue to be learning and growing in that, it's something that as I have adjusted and am moving into a different position and thinking about things and reflecting on things, it's figuring out how do I word things appropriately that actually are for the betterment, instead of just rehashing old arguments or rehashing things, and trying to show and help people and help even myself understand more of where am I blind. And I think that's a hard thing. And I think that's, I would assume, but as I've watched parents do, sometimes the difficult thing with being a parent is it's easy to be able to necessarily, this is what should have been done, but being able to walk them through and help them understand, or being at this moment, is this the appropriate time? That have they done the discipline themselves where they're humiliated enough to not necessarily go lay into them? It's that moment of finding the difficult line of tough love and love that needs to be sometimes drawn. So let's just get into it. There's a lot to get through this week. So the semi-continuous text this week is out of 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 5 to 9. verse 15, and 31 through 33. This is a hard spot to be dropping in because there's a lot of the story that we're missing here. But this is about King David with his son Absalom. Now, Absalom is his third son. It's a son that David has a lot of fond love for. But Absalom is kind of power hungry, has figured out ways to essentially try to rise up a coup to overtake his dad, to the point where David then has to rise up an army against him. And he is stating to his army, "Be kind to my son. Please, anything we can. I understand my son's having a teenage moment. Be kind to him, but we got to still put up the force." Well, Absalom is running with his mule, and he is known for his long flowing hair. It gets stuck in a great oak, and he ends up being hung along with the different army men going in and making sure that he is dead. This saddens David tremendously when this type of thing happens. And we get that in verse 33. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." The cry that you hear of a parent, why not me? It should have been me instead of my son. And we get from David here. And the psalm that goes with that is a lament. It's Psalm 130, and it's "Out of the depths I cry to you, hearing my voice, Lord. Hear and understand that I'm needing forgiveness, that I am waiting for you, and I know that I'm a sinner, and I know that I fall short, and I am trying, and make sure that the love that you have is spread not only to me, but in this case Israel, but the people of God, that love is being able to be shared and shown and felt and made a mark within our lives." The other Old Testament text this week is out of 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4 to 8. Again, this is another story that needs a little backstory. This is after King David has died. The tribe of Israel has split due to some bad kings. We now have Elijah rise up. Elijah is challenging the northern kingdom and what is going on, not necessarily agreeing. He has shown that God is the true God with the whole lighting the sacrifice on fire, even though there was water being poured after they had been praying to their gods for days. And then the queen of the northern kingdom puts out essentially a ransom for Elijah. Elijah runs to save his life. And that's where we pick this story up. And that Elijah's like, what am I doing here? Like, God, just have me die. I'm exhausted. I'm trying to save my life here. And I'm really not seeing why the heck you're doing this. God wakes up Elijah and says, "Okay, there's some food here that an angel put here. There's some water. Eat and drink. You're going to need this. We have a long journey here. Go up and we're going to tackle this together. You're not alone in this. I'm with you. Let's do this together." That leads into Psalm 34, the first 8 verses of it. And this is then, because of that, recognizing that we should be praising the God continually. Recognizing that in doing that, it humbles ourselves, it magnifies who God is, and that we continue to then be seeking after who God is. That it allows us to be able to see the radiance of who God is in and amongst us a lot easier, and is able to help us deliver us through whatever trials and tribulations we're going through, recognizing that God is there. The epistle text this week, our second reading, is from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25 to chapter 5, verse 2. We continue in Ephesians here, but it's this recognition of how we should be speaking life, that we should not just be casting each other aside because we sin, recognizing that in all of us working together, that the Holy Spirit then is able to actually do the work of who God is, that we do not have to grieve the Holy Spirit as it's stated in verse 30, but we have been marked with redemption. We have been marked recognizing that we are going to fall short, but we can do so much more, that we are the children of the beloved God who are loved so much by God. And that is what then will continue to help us guide us through as we continue to fall short, that God continues to pick us up, love on us, and help us move forward. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 6, verse 35 and verses 41 to 51. And this is continuing that bread of life discourse, recognizing that I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be thirsty and never be hungry again. And this is where we start getting some questions that different people there. What are you talking about? Aren't you the son of Joseph? What are you talking about coming down from heaven? And Jesus continues to lay this out, that it was not the prophets that gave you the food to eat. It was my Father who made sure and provided for you, just like your ancestors in the wilderness. This was not Moses who was taking care of this. This was God taking care of you, and I will continue to be there and make sure that you have this enduring life based on the fact that I am here. I am taking care of you. I will make sure of that because that's what I'm here to do, and that's what my Father is going to make sure of, that you are well taken care of, that you are provided for. You have to be able to recognize this, though, and recognize that this is part of that relationship to bring us closer together. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, get some just great commentaries going through. This week, I looked at some of the different commentaries just to make sure that I was understanding the backstory of some of these different texts. They're a great resource, so if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the art week to week. I still enjoy how they lay out the text better than most. I like their old way better, but there's also a lot of hymns, prayers, daily devotions, looking at the liturgical colors that go along with the year. There's a lot of great resources over here. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that also. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through these different texts similar to this, bringing in ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to be utilized in a weekly preaching scenario, or it also goes through and brings up different ideas, notices, great things to be thinking about eco-friendly and thinking more about the environment as a whole. If you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week for a half an hour each week, I'd highly recommend looking and signing up for these newsletters. Those will be down, the first links down in the show notes. We have another week of God talking about providing. And I think we need to think about this a little bit deeper and recognize how embedded into how we see the world this actually is. And it's kind of freaky, especially that we are now finding this more and more. And we'll get into another more recent scientific story within the last few months that has come out. And I think this is worth talking about. So first we need to talk about endosymbiosis. Now, endosymbiosis is a relationship that is mutual, a mutual beneficial relationship where two organisms come together to become an organelle. So two independent things come together and actually become embedded within themselves. There is still some individuality within that, but they are still one thing. They are still, when they are reproducing, they will reproduce so that they continue to be within that new thing, that new organelle. And this is how your cells work. If you look at the cell, there is the nucleus, which has your DNA and how to make you. But the ability to have that happen is because you have a mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. This is where much of the energy that is in your body is produced and being able to be captured. And it's because of that mitochondria that you are able to have a nucleus. It would otherwise be too taxing for our cells to have this. The mitochondria was its own organelle, this own thing, and it, through endosymbiosis, essentially got absorbed into, and seeing that it had a comfy place to be, a comfy place to live, and that it was being provided for, giving the nutrients that it needed. The excess energy that it was putting off allowed the cell to be able to have more energy and thus being able to create a nucleus, which is allowed for the ability to have multicellular organisms, thus allowing for us to even exist, having the ability for that to happen based off the foundation of how cells worked. We can also see this in chloroplasts within plants. Chloroplasts are this amazing structure within there that allow from their structure the basic fundamentals of being able to do similar to what a mitochondria does, and they have still some mitochondria in the DNA, but being able to take in that sunlight like you hear with photosynthesis, allowing for photosynthesis to be part of what they are doing, to be able to help in getting that energy going to start that cycle and allowing for that energy to be in the cell. This is so important for plant cells. This is vital to our world and how our earth works. If we didn't have both animal cells and plant cells, how we imagine life on earth would not be possible. And these have been seen as the only two endosymbiosis that we had known of until this year. This year, we have discovered a new type of endosymbiosis, and this is so cool. We're noticing it in just small algae bacteria at this point, but we are calling it a nitroplast. Now, what we need to then go through is a little bit more of the plant cycle. Plants need nitrogen in order to make the different proteins and structures that they need for a plant to grow. The problem is we have a lot of nitrogen in our atmosphere, but it's N2. It's two nitrogens. And that's where if you hear of like within farming communities or even within garden that you need to put down fertilizer, and a lot of times it's nitrogen. And what farmers will do is sometimes instead of throwing down nitrogen fertilizer, they put in these plants, typically like legumes, so like soybeans or clover or peas. These are nitrogen fixing plants. And what that means is on the roots of the plant, there are these nodules which are cohesive to having bacteria that break down nitrogen into different forms, and thus encouraging other types of bacteria to continue to break it down into other forms of nitrogen to be around. And thus it's in the soil, which allows for, that's why you hear with farmers that there's a rotation of crops, allowing for plants to have these nutrients in the ground. So you have certain plants, take corn for instance, is huge at absorbing all this nitrogen, and it doesn't really put anything into the ground. So if it takes all the nitrogen out, the crop becomes weaker and weaker and weaker over time because it doesn't have the nutrient of nitrogen in the soil for it to be able to grow. Whereas then when you take a pea plant and allow that, or soybeans or clover, and do that for a year, that re-puts that back into the soil, which allows for, if you bring in corn the next year, for it to grow. And this is something that you hear like sister plants from, like in North America, the Native American community. They were doing a lot of these different types of things where, okay, we're going to have these different, typically it was like corn to grow up, you have your beans or peas to climb that corn stalk, and then pumpkins to fill the ground. But part of the beauty of that was you had a nitrogen fixing plant right by different plants that were going to absorb a lot of this nitrogen and allowing for this to be happening. What is so exciting about these nitroplasts is, as we were hearing, the plants are so dependent on this bacteria being there for them to be able to get and build the structures that they need to be able to grow and survive. This is becoming the first organelle that we have noticed that has then taken in a bacteria that does this, so thus it can produce its own nitrogen. And this is huge because over the next multi-centuries, if we're going from a scientific perspective, multi-centuries, we should be able to start seeing more and more potential plants and stuff that have this over the next millennia. And with having these mutualistic relationships of bacteria and plants has meant that plants, yes, they're creating these nodules, but they're also giving up sugars and different things for these bacteria to be able to be happy and satisfied, and thus them providing the extra nitrogen for the plants to be able to grow. But this is a very intensive and energy consuming process that we are now starting to see the beginnings of different species, algae, marine algae, being able to do this is incredible. And it's now the third endosymbiotic relationship that we are finding at a molecular level. And so this is huge. This came out here in April this year. So it's, again, still cutting news. They're still figuring this stuff out. Who knows? Maybe we find that this is way more prevalent than we realize. We're thinking of based off of what we're looking at and looking at the DNA. This has been around for a long time. It's just that we haven't noticed it. So it's this amazing relationship to be able to have where now yet again, the plant is going to be able to provide more for itself. And it's incredible to be thinking about. And again, I'll attach some different things down in the show notes if you're interested in this. It's worth looking through and thinking about. But how does this tie in to all this stuff that we hear? What I hear in John, who is so dense with theology, but what John is trying to get across here in Jesus going through this bread of life discourse is that God wants to provide, and God will continue to provide as long as we are open and looking and will receive the gift. And so I think when we start recognizing that we are literally built on these endosymbiotic relationships, we start seeing that it's literally built into who we are. How God designed us is seeing these relationships, that there is still going to be your own DNA, but there's also the mitochondrial DNA within you, that they're separate things, but they also together make something totally different. It allows for you to become a multicellular organism, to become such a greater thing. And thus animal cells and the variety of animal life was able to take off because of it. We look at chloroplasts being able to be within plant cells, and that allowed them to be able to grow and be able to do amazing things and provide oxygen and complete that cycle that we are so dependent on. But yet, it was allowing them to be able to grow and expand in ways that we'd never imagined before, thinking back. And that's how it has continued to help provide life. And now we are finding that here we are having small single-celled algae being able to take care of their own nitrogen needs by these endosymbiotic relationships. Jesus is reiterating that we need to be in these relationships together. Paul has been working on, instead of fighting, why aren't we working together and seeing that spirit within us? And it gets back to my rant at the beginning. I think as a church, we need to be really thinking about the words of what Paul is saying, and how do we as individuals and as Big C Church work to put aside some of these differences and bickering to actually come together and work together. And I know that means every one of us, including myself, have things that we need to work on to get beyond some of these different differences and things where we get frustrated. We see how God continues to provide for Elijah. And I'm here. I am with you. I am going to make sure that you are okay. I understand why you are scared, but do you not remember that I am with you and I'm not just leaving you? And that's where 2 Samuel comes in. Because we got to remember the difference between Absalom and King David. Absalom figures out ways to try to overtake his dad. And it's out of jealousy. He wants to be able to rule. He wants to have control. I'm going to find the things and talk to the people and figure out how to get people to join my side and hear their complaints and recognize the weaknesses with my dad. And I'm going to play into that. But nowhere in that conversation was the recognition of being able to, one, connect with God on it. And how often we are like Absalom in that way. That we figure out something, we're so set on it, and there's no way that God isn't with us. But second of all, how calm David appears in all of this, recognizing my son is being crazy, he's trying to do something, and instead of coming and talking to me about it, he's just going to raise up his own thing. He'll learn in time. But the calmness and the wisdom that we're seeing from King David here is something that we can all learn from. But what is that also from? It's from this relationship that he has with God. recognizing that God will continue to provide. And yes, Absalom's maybe bringing up some good things where I am weak, but I'm also recognizing that God will continue to help provide for me to be able to overcome these weaknesses or see these weaknesses and grow in these weaknesses. And we've been seeing that the last few weeks with David. David is not flawless, but David also understands the value of the relationship that he has with God. Elijah is learning to trust the relationship that he has with God. Paul is trying to remind the people of Ephraim, you are so much stronger together with the relationship that you have with God and with each other. And Jesus reminding the people, the relationship that I have with you through our Heavenly Father is so much stronger and will continue to provide for you long after your stomach is empty. That there is so much more that I'm trying to give you. There is so much here God continues to provide. Can you not see it? Can you not see the endosymbiotic relationships that I have built into you? That I have built into so many things around you, that they recognize that they are stronger together. They recognize the benefit of working together. They recognize the benefit of relationship. You are not meant to take on this whole thing alone. You're not supposed to just be isolating yourself. Elijah runs away, and what is happening at the end of the text? Elijah is going back. The church in Ephraim is splitting apart. Paul is trying to bring them back together. Jesus trying to help the people understand it was God who was providing for you. Do you not understand the relationship that God is trying to have with you? These relationships are built into the core of who we are. So the question I have for you this week is, have you seen the importance of these types of relationships? Have you seen the importance of these types of relationships? It's one of the things that I really do enjoy about biology. It's a recognition of food cycles. It's a recognition of how everything is so interconnected together. And in doing that, I do not feel it's that separate. I think it's so integral if we're seeing these types of things and how a whole ecosystem is all dependent on all these different relationships. Why would we not think that God is desiring for us to have this great relationship with God, but also for us to be so interconnected with each other? And in a world that we are in currently, where we are connected but not connected, based off of electronic devices, based off of even this conversation that we're having, it's not the same as necessarily us sitting on the couch. I try to make this hopefully feel like we're having a conversation, but I think we all realize there is something different being face to face. A quick aside, with the new position I was in, one of the things we had to do a couple weeks ago is we had to travel and going and working with a client. And one of the things that was very palpable was from some early meetings that we had with the client, there were definitely some walls that were up where they were nervous, they were concerned, they were proceeding with caution, and rightfully so. There were people who had been in their jobs for decades, and suddenly we're talking about potentially doing something different. But the power of us showing up, being in the room, talking with them, having them understand that we had their best interest in mind and trying to genuinely understand how they were doing things and disrupt it in the smallest way possible, but while also trying to make it easier for them, to make their jobs more efficient, to be so that it's a win for everybody. The walls came crumbling down, and how the relationships you could suddenly feel in the basically 48 hours we were there deepened so much. I think when we actually go and start looking and recognizing the relationships around us, how nature does this, how we should be doing this, I think we start realizing how this is a core fundamental principle to who we are called to be. It's literally built into the cells of who we are. I think it's hard to deny that we have a God who wants to have a relationship with us, who wants to be connected to us. And I think that's an important thing for us to realize. I think it's an important thing for us to then go and continue to seek and to find and make all the connections, elementary and advanced. Because I think the more we see it, the more we'll actually understand what this bread that God is trying to provide us, that sustains so much more and continues to show that I have continued to provide for your ancestors, and I want to continue to provide for you and for future generations. So I'm not going anywhere because I love and care about you. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.